My name's Yvette Cantu Schneider, and I'm an XX gay leader.
Address this Freedom March, what you think of it, what you'd like to tell people who might get sucked into the ex-gay industry by seeing this spectacle on the street.
I'm concerned about the Freedom March because we've seen this so many times before. I was involved in the movement for 20 years, and people would get excited like, oh, I don't have to be gay anymore, and that means that my parents will approve of me, my pastor will approve of me, my church will approve of me, but no one ever changes. So it just becomes this burden that you're saddled with, trying to please people around you, try to be something you're not, and it only ends up in destruction. People become depressed, and they start living double lives, and their lives just get more and more burdened down, and it never leads to anything good. I have seen this countless times over and over and over again. I have seen gay men marry women. Is that fair to the woman when then 10 years later the husband decides to leave the family? I've seen lesbians marry men, and then now they don't know what to do. They're not attracted to their husbands are their friends, they love them, but now they have to tear the family apart in order to be who they really are and who they should have been able to be for their entire lives. I think the Freedom March is exactly the opposite of freedom, because you're actually becoming imprisoned by expectations that other people have for you. And instead of being free to be who you are, you're being forced to be someone that you're not. And I know a lot of people think, well, I'm choosing this for myself. Most of those people are young, they're impressionable, they're listening to people in their worlds, which I understand. They're listening to pastors, they're listening to parents, but they're not able to actually embrace who they are, how they feel, who they're attracted to, and live an open, free life. It's exactly the opposite of that.
And what will the end result be for these folks who get sucked into it?
Over and over again, I've seen people who are engaged in the ex-gay movement, and they spend years in it. It's nothing that they ever overcome. So they're going to conferences year after year after year. They're joining groups until it becomes their identity, and they spend their whole lives having an ex-gay identity instead of just having a gay identity and living according to their attractions. So what happens when you're not authentic and living according to your authentic self? You become depressed, anxious. You just see all sorts of mental health issues like that, where that's what happens when you're covering things up. And it can get so far to the point of even being in the realm of post-traumatic stress because you haven't been able to be who you are.
I see examples where they are telling these tales of inspiration. In reality, they're desperation. Talk about this is what their whole thing is. Look how happy I am. What is the reality of that? Because that's what they're swearing by.
In the beginning, I think people are happy because you think, hey, maybe next month I'm not going to have same-sex attractions anymore. Maybe 3 months from now or 6 months from now. And so there's this initial rush. And it's also feeling as if you're going to be accepted. Finally, you're going to be doing what everyone wants you to do. You're going to be part of the crowd. You're going to be doing what your pastor wants you to do, what your parents want you to do, what your church wants you to do. And suddenly you feel like, yeah, I'm where I'm supposed to be. This feels so great. So the initial rush, and then the bloom leaves the rose very quickly when you realize, look, I'm not changing. I'm the same as I've always been. And now I have to continue to live up to this act because I've been doing this for so long now, and people expect it of me.
When we spoke to John Smid, he said he had never seen anybody change from gay to straight. Randy Thomas said the same thing, Alan Chambers. What is your experience? Because we keep with the Freedom March and with Change Movement, there are all these stories. Have you ever seen any success of all your time in this movement?
I've never seen any success. I've never seen anyone change from gay to straight ever. We'd see people that were coming to Exodus conferences, and they'd come for a decade, and they could be married, they could not be married, but they're still having the same-sex feelings. They never go away.
And then what does ex-gay mean?
Ex-gay is just a term used by the church to describe people who they can say, look, God has changed them. But that's not true. So it's really just this false moniker that's used sort of as a badge of honor. I will say, God made people the way they are. There's nothing that needs to be changed. And I think that's where people are falling. They're not realizing, no, you're just fine the way you are. There's always going to be something that you think that you need to change about yourself. You don't. You're fine the way you are.
What's the deal with these people who've been there for 10 years, 20 years? I mean, how do they do this? What are they telling themselves? If they're not changing, what's the motivation to stay in for so long?
There's this huge fear of disappointing people. There's a fear that you're going to disappoint God, that you're going to disappoint your family, that you're going to disappoint your friends. And then the people who are going to these ex-gay ministries make friends in the ex-gay ministries. So this is your complete social group. It's very hard to uproot from a social group and say, I'm just going to set out on my own. The people I talk to who have done that, it's been difficult because they've had to leave everyone they love, for the most part, who aren't supporting them, to go and live their authentic lives. It's not an easy step to take.
And I want to address the changed movement as well, specifically.
I'm concerned about the change movement because I was the director of women's ministry for Exodus International. And when I started, I thought, we're going to be writing books and pamphlets, and we're going to be having gatherings, and it's going to be so great. You know what I spent my time doing? Dealing with leaders in ex-gay ministries who were having sex with the people who were coming to them for help. That is what disillusioned me the most of anything, because it wasn't just that people were changing, it was that leaders were actually taking advantage of their positions in leadership and having sex with people who were coming to them for help. And that's when I knew, if the leaders, the people who have been chosen to be leaders, aren't changing, no one's changing.
What would you say to someone who is with their parents, they are thinking of doing this, their parents are putting pressure on them, but they're on the brink of doing it, but they teetering?
I would just implore anyone who's thinking of joining an ex-gay group not to do it. I have seen more unhealthy dynamics there than I have in any other group I've ever been a part of in my life. And the results are always destruction and despair. So if I could tell anyone, I would beg anyone, please don't go and do that. People don't change, and it just oppresses them. So they end up in actually a worse situation than they were to begin with, which is just dealing with issues of self-loathing and depression. It's not something that you want to get in at all. I know parents love their children and want what's best for them. And what is best for them is to let them live their authentic lives and not to burden them with expectations that they can't live up to.
1998, the Truth and Love campaign. That's when I first got involved. That's when I first heard of you and the Family Research Council. Take us into the planning of that campaign. The whole 1998.
Oh, I remember. I remember. I had just come to FRC in July of 1998, something like that. And so this was one of the big campaigns that we were first doing. I remember being at a press conference, and someone from the press asked me a question: what are you going to do about this? And John Paul jumped in and said, I'm going to answer that question. We're going to have this campaign, and it's something that we've been planning. And I remember they're trying to pick people who are going to be the best people to put out there. And of course, they want people who are married. I wasn't married at the time, so I wasn't going to be a part of it. And it was, I mean, they really thought this is going to be it. This is going to really put us on the map and we're going to get out there. Okay, so that's how someone like Focus on the Family is looking at it. Like, we're going to put ourselves out there as the people who are leading this change movement. And that's what Focus on the Family wanted to do, is really sort of be the beacon. But I didn't work for Focus on the Family. I worked for Family Research Council. So where we're coming from is we just need to show that people can change, because then we can pass or not pass whatever policies we want. Employment non-discrimination, gay marriage, hate crimes legislation. If people can change, then there's no reason to protect them. So that's how we're looking at the 1998 campaign.
And they denied it at the time. When pressured, they said this isn't about politics,
It's always about politics. It's always about politics. And there's no way that places like Focus on the Family or FRC would get the money that they do if it weren't about politics and changing money.
It seems Family Research Council is very excited about this. Bob Knight called this the Normandy Landing and the Cultural Wars.
That's right.
Take us there.
So we were in the room, we were talking about how the LGBT movement was gaining so much momentum. What are we going to do to slow the momentum down? It had nothing to do with, oh, these poor gay people, we need to change them from gay to straight. It was, they are a tool. And this is something that we need in order to make sure that the legislation we don't want to pass doesn't pass. And if people can change from gay to straight, then they don't need to be protected in any way. They just need to change from gay to straight.
Sounds cynical.
Yeah. I mean, but that's what it is. That is what it was. And I'll tell you, when I worked at Family Research Council and I spoke at Dartmouth once, and they yelled at me, and there was a lot of brouhaha around the whole thing. They had me, the Monday I got back to work, write their newsletter to asking for money. And the month before, Dr. Dobson had written it, and they had gotten more money than they had ever gotten before. The following month, so following on his footsteps, I wrote it, the appeal, talking about my experience at Dartmouth. That brought in the second most after Dr. Dobson. And why? Because I was talking about gay activists and how terrible they were to me at Dartmouth. And look what we as Christians can expect. We can expect these gay activists to just come after us and attack us. So it was a great way to make money.
Did they talk about this as a financial cash cow?
Yes. I mean, it was so clear that it was a financial cash cow because, it wasn't, they were worried about my well-being when I was at Dartmouth, but fast on its heels was, how can we cash in on this?
Mm-hmm. And so they sent out frequent fundraising letters using it for that? Yes.
Fundraising letters had issues about gay rights every month.
Jerry Falwell once said, if homosexuals didn't exist, you'd have to invent them in terms of raising money. Was it similar point of view?
Absolutely, yeah. It brought in so much money. When FRC brought me on, there was just a single person in Virginia who was paying my salary.
Mm-hmm. Who came up with this idea, though, to embrace this strategy? How did it come about?
I think there's a whole historical element to that when it comes to the Christian right and Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich and some of these people who were in the political realm saying, we need something to hang our hat on. We need something that's going to bring in the Christian bloc, the Christian voters who aren't really that interested in politics. They don't really want to vote. They don't want to dirty their hands with the messiness of politics. How are we going to attract them? So, of course, there was the abortion issue, and that was a big one to attract people. But there's something much more sinister about the gays. The gays are sinister. They're coming to recruit our children. They're molesters. They're pedophiles. And that's what really got people going. Oh, they're going to teach about homosexuality in schools. And suddenly it was like, we found what is really going to rile people up, and it's going to get them in the voting booths.
Anita Bryant, before that, it was a lot of save the children, very harsh.
Yes.
The ex-gay embrace was a turn of events in a way, where it was, oh, we're not here to condemn you, we're here to help you.
Exactly.
It was just to talk about that strategic change and how that came about, and the messaging around that.
When you look at Anita Bryant, she was made fun of so much. And then the Christians sort of backed away from her because it was just an attack on people. And that is not what Christians are about, supposedly. That's what they know. You know, we're all about loving people. We have to love people. You know, we hate the sin, not the sinner. So how can we put that into action? Oh, you know what? You don't really have to be gay. And so we're actually helping you because your eternal soul is in peril if you're gay. So we need to come in and help and show you, look, this is just for your good. We're not against you, we're for you, we're helping you, we're showing you the way. And that was the attitude.
How effective was that message for a while?
I think it was very effective. Where people, and especially with parents, because parents wanted what was best for their kids. And they're thinking, well, what's best for my kid is going to be A, not to go to hell, B, to have a family, you know, mom and dad and kids. This is going to be what's best for my kids because we want them to fit in with society.
Focus on the family. A family research council, at any point did they consider the well-being of what are the impact of these campaigns might have on actual people? Absolutely
not. No. I would say no.
Can we include the question?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that. It was never once mentioned in any of the meetings I was in any of the conversations that I had in the hallways with anyone, that we were truly concerned about the gay boy, the gay girl, the lesbian, the bisexual. Ever were they mentioned as individuals, living, breathing human beings, and what would happen to them, and how these campaigns would affect them, and what their lives would be like. That was never considered.
And then John Paul, I photographed him in Mr. P's,
Yes.
a gay bar in Washington, D.C. Take us through the reaction and what happened with that.
So John came to my office the morning after. You caught him at Mr. P's. He was very nervous. He had a cup of coffee that he was spilling on my carpet, and Pete came in, La Barbara was like mopping it up, and John was telling us, no, I just went in there to go to the bathroom. That was all. I wasn't doing anything. And so Pete said, well, I'm gonna write a press release. I'm gonna handle this, and don't worry about it. And then it was, well, I had a drink, but it was just because I was comfortable being in gay bars. That's where I had hung out before. And so as the story was changing, then people, at least at Family Research Council, were like, see, you just can't trust these gay guys. They are not ex-gay. And these were conversations that we were having.
Really? They were actually acknowledging?
They were acknowledging that gay guys do not change.
And at that point, did they think of apologizing to the LGBT community and said, whoops, we were wrong. We screwed up. What we said wasn't true?
Never.
They never.
It was never considered that we should say, you know what, we've seen it firsthand, the gay people don't change, we should apologize, we should back off from this. No, it's more like, okay, we need to really find people who are more solid. And that's one of the reasons why Family Research Council hired a woman, me, and not a man, because they really didn't trust the men.
Mm-hmm. Now, Janet Folger Porter was a big driving force in the 1998 Truth and Love campaign.
Well, Janet Folger likes to say that it was her idea, and she really wanted credit for being the one who thought of this 1998 campaign. And it was all just sort of building her brand, as we would say these days. Like, she had done so much in the abortion movement, she wanted to make her name somewhere else as well and just have broader appeal.
Ralph Reed once called her, said about it, she was an issues entrepreneur.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I would say that's absolutely true. It was just, you know, there are certain people who are just all about upward mobility. And what's the next thing that's going to get me attention? What's the next thing that's going to get me attention? So it was all about how can I bring attention to myself in some way.
So in general, was there happiness with the way the campaign went, and why did it subside?
We got what we wanted out of it because we could always go back to that in terms of trying to stop certain legislations, pieces of legislation. So in that way, it didn't need to continue. Mm-hmm. And it cost money. And so that no one wanted to keep pouring money into that. And no one wanted to keep giving attention to people who could potentially fall and have sex with someone of the same sex. There was always that concern. So it's like, get in the spotlight, get out of the spotlight.
Was the ex-gay issue, did it resonate with lawmakers, Republicans in particular? Did they believe it? Those who were lobbied afterwards for this legislation?
Yeah, the people that we lobbied, because I would go up every Wednesday with a group, they loved it. The lawmakers loved it because then they had something to hang their hat on.
So they actually
can
use
say,
this.
Yeah, we don't, we're not for employment non-discrimination because these people, they don't have to be gay. And we don't need to institute hate crimes legislation because they don't have to be gay. They're choosing to be or they're choosing not to be, but we don't have to protect these people.
Peter LaBarbera.
Peter LaBarbera was dedicated and still is to making sure that gay people don't have rights. And this was something he got into after communism fell. So he was all into anti-communism, and then he didn't have anything else to do. So he had to find something else to do, and this is what it was, and this is what he found to do.
What do you think accounts for his fanaticism? I mean, it seems like he's very dedicated.
I mean, honestly, I don't know. I really don't know what would motivate someone who didn't have a personal interest to spend decades of their lives fighting against basically a people group. So you're choosing to oppress a people group for your livelihood for decades.
Robert Knight. Talk about him, your experience.
So Bob Knight was my boss at Family Research Council, and he was a very meticulous, very smart, very dedicated, and I think I was similar to him in the sense of we knew that we were right. We knew that we had the answers, and we were doing this all for the glory of God. And that was what was behind it all. And at that point, I did, Bob did, the way I see Bob, you just become very myopic, where what's happening in real time to real people isn't being considered at all. It's just, this is what we have to do. And when we worked at Family Research Council and Bob did, enemies were definitely seen at Human Rights Campaign. This person's doing this, so we have to counter it. Or, every week it was open the Washington Blade, who's doing what? So it became a very personal, someone here is doing this, we have to counter that. Someone's doing this, we have to counter it. It was never looking at the culture as a whole, never looking at people as a whole, but just who is the individual that I'm coming up against.
Gary Bauer, what was his role in all this?
Gary Bauer's the one who hired me. And I didn't have a whole lot of contact with him because he took a leave of absence to run for president shortly after I came. But he was the one who sort of organized everything and we worked in a branch of Family Research Council called Cultural Studies, and he's the one who instituted that and was really the one to push, fighting the gays out into the forefront of Family Research Council.
Is there anything I'm missing that we should know about the 1998 Truth and Love campaign?
I remember when People magazine came out with John and Ann Polk, and Bob Knight talking about how tacky it was to have them sitting on the bed, and thought it was like, why are you just hitting people over the head? You're trying to make it seem like, these are two formerly gay people who actually have sex with each other. That was very uncomfortable. I remember that part where it just seemed like, okay, this is getting to be a little bit of a circus, and it would be nice if we could have people that didn't look so silly and so foolish. It's almost as if there was some regret of putting ex-lesbians and ex-gay men who were now married out there as the poster people for this movement, because it seemed so almost sordid or planned, or was this an arranged marriage, that sort of thing. And so that's when, Bob and we talked about that, and some other people at FRC, like, how does this really look? This looks premeditated. This looks planned and arranged.
Was everyone surprised how much media there was? I mean, it was extraordinary how much. It was covered in Newsweek as well. Oprah, I mean, it was really all on the level we haven't seen before or since.
I think we were all surprised and happy because it worked in our favor. I was raised Roman Catholic, and it was more of a nominal thing. We didn't go to church all the time, but I did have that sort of Christian upbringing in the sense of Jesus, Mary, God, that I was just sort of pushed to the side as I got into my teen years. But I noticed that I was having same-sex attractions when I was like 11, 12 years old. And I hate to use that terminology, but that's the terminology that I'm familiar with and that I've used. But I did, I'd have crushes on friends, but I also had crushes on boys. So these days I would say I'm bisexual, but I kind of went back and forth when I was a teenager and starting from 11 years old, where, now I have a crush on someone who's this gender and someone who's that gender. And that's sort of how it went through high school. And I had my first lesbian relationship in India when I was there on the Education Abroad program. So I felt like, people that I know aren't here. No one's going to know what I'm doing. I don't have to listen to pressure from my society, especially. It wasn't so much my parents I was concerned about, just, what are other people going to think? Just random people, what are they going to think? And so, I had my first relationship when I was in India, and then I was in another one with a woman when I got back for about a year, followed by a relationship with a woman for 3 years after that. And then, I just kind of
At any point were you out during this to anyone?
Yes, I was out. Once I got back from India.
Who'd you tell, and what was the reaction?
I told my sister first, and she's like, well, you better not tell Mom. My parents were divorced by now. I never told my dad. I told my mom, and she said, you need extensive psychological help. And I said, really, because they removed homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1976. I knew this. And she's like, well, I mean, you're going to do what you're going to do, but you're not going to do it here. And I said, fine, because I never planned on doing it here anyway.
What impact did that have on you, rejection by your mom? Was it pretty painful?
I didn't have a great relationship with my mom throughout my childhood. So all it did was make me more angry at her than I already was. And I thought, this just isn't right. And I was sort of motivated to be activistic. And I remember going in Laguna Beach, going to a GLAAD meeting there. They would hold, I mean, this was back when GLAAD was baby, they're brand new. They would send out monthly newsletters that were stapled together on white paper. That was back in those days.
And what was the journey from being relatively out to people to getting involved with your job at the Family Research Council? Take us on that journey.
Okay,
How did that happen?
yeah, I mean, it is sort of crazy because I didn't have that real sense of self-loathing or I'm doing something wrong like a lot of people who are brought up in the church do. I didn't have that at all. But I worked with a guy at a law firm in downtown LA who talked about God all the time. And it was just, and being gay is wrong, and I'd hear this from him all the time. Meanwhile, I'm going to the pride parades in West Hollywood and the ones in Long Beach. And I basically told this guy to shut up most of the time. But there reached a point where I had had a bad breakup. My best friend was dying of AIDS, Ed. In all total, 17 of my friends died of AIDS. And I look at that as the pivotal point. It's like, I'm like 27 years old. I should not have that many friends who are dying and dead. I lived with 2 gay men who I helped while they were in the final stages, both of them, with AIDS. And it was tough. It was really hard. And I was looking for something where I could feel as if I fit in and belonged that seemed like a safe harbor, I guess you'd say. And so this guy that I was working with, Jeff, invited me to church, and I was so torn about going, but I did go, and that is sort of what got me into it. Which, let me just add, Jeff is out of it now, too. Jeff and I are still friends. He's apologized to me, even though this took over decades of my life, decades of his life. But he has gotten to the point, too, where he said, this is just none of this stuff is right. None of what we're seeing the American church do to people is right.
So you're in this church and it was appealing to you, and you took to it right away, or how did this process?
I went to church and I met people there who I really liked. And that's what got me into it. Like, I had immediate friendships right away. And this was a church, you'd look at it now and say, that wasn't a church, that was a cult, which can probably be said of many churches in America these days, because they would have houses that we could live in and were encouraged to live in. They would call them staff houses. And so students at Long Beach State, UCLA, USC would live in these staff houses, and then people who were out of college, like I was. So they could really indoctrinate you into their thinking. And so we had what were called disciplers. So these were people who mentored you. So one of them comes up to me and says, I saw a spirit of homosexuality on you, and we need to cast it out. So she and another woman, in the living room of one of their homes, they lay hands on me and they cast out the demon of homosexuality and invite in the spirit of purity and holiness. And that was supposed to be the end of it. They put me on quarantine. I was living in one of the houses, and they said, you can't do anything but go to work, come home, read your Bible, pray. You can't hang out with anyone. So they closed me off from all the other people who were my friends. And there was a point when I thought, I'm just going to pack up my stuff and leave. But at that point, where did I have to go? And this is what I always come back to. It's like it is a big deal to pack up and leave, because if you don't have an established community, as an established friend group to go and stay with, what are you going to do? So I felt like, well, now I've painted myself into this corner. I have to stay here.
What denomination was this?
It was a non-denominational church.
What was it? What's the name of it? I'm just out of curiosity. I'm just curious. What, like a church that does that?
Every Nation.
Every Nation?
It's called Every Nation. It was Morning Star, and then it became Every Nation.
Is it still going on?
It's still going on. And they have outreaches throughout the world.
What was your initial impression when they did the laying of the hands and the demonic, the spiritual warfare? Did you think it was odd, or did you think it was going to work?
I thought, look, this isn't going to be that hard for me. I can just, find a nice man. That's not going to really be an issue for me. I looked at it more like that. Like, I don't have to be with women. I can be with men too. So it's not going to be like it would be with someone who was just exclusively gay, where they would, well, now what do I do? So I just thought, well, I can do this. And I had the mentality that I think a lot of people do, where it's, well, I want to please God, because you look at it and God is either going to bless you or God is going to punish you. Well, I don't want to be punished. And I had completely bought into that. So I have to do whatever it is that I have to do, so God will be pleased with me and my life will go well.
The bisexual experience is much different than going through an ex-gay program than someone who's exclusively gay.
Absolutely. The bisexual experience is completely different, because you can be attracted to one or the other sex. What drives me nuts is when people think that you can't be in a faithful, committed relationship if you're bisexual, and think that you're always going to be looking around, which I don't see how that makes any sense, because someone could be doing that who was heterosexual or gay and still looking around for someone else to be with.
So how did this lead? You're at this strange cultish type of ministry. How did you end up with Gary Bauer looking at you and saying, I want you to be our spokesperson? Talk about that transition and how that came to pass.
So I was actually then working in campus ministry for this church at UCLA. And there was someone on campus, yes, one of the pastors on campus was open air preaching. And I guess some gay guy was coming up to him and had all these challenges. So he pulls me up and says, well, Yvette, tell him your story, because he thinks this is just going to then shut him down. I had never done anything like that before. So here, open air preaching at UCLA. Well, I used to be a lesbian and I'm not anymore. So then it sort of got out a lot. Not everyone knew this about me. And I don't know, there was this young black woman, Lakita Garth, and she was on, what's his name? Politically Incorrect a lot. And she was doing a lot of anti-abortion things. And someone from Orange County contacted her and said, hey, there's this pastor and he's got this cable TV show. Do you know anyone who can be on it, who can speak to homosexuality and not being gay anymore? And she's like, yeah, my friend Yvette. Well, Joe Dallas was on that show, and he brought a couple of his patients on there, and I was on there. And from there, from having seen that show, I was invited to do Christian Outreach Week, which was also called Christian Leadership Week in Orange County, where for a week leading up to the mayor's prayer breakfast, they have meetings in people's homes, and people tell their testimony. I was healed of cancer. I don't smoke anymore. I'm not an alcoholic anymore. I'm not a drug addict anymore. I was in prison and now I'm not. And so they had me do my story, which I had never done before. And it was at a house in Laguna Niguel. And I spoke, had a bunch of my friends there. The place was packed out. And after it was over, I spoke for an hour. The woman in the front row stood up and said, how would you feel about relocating to Washington, D.C.? Well, it ends up that she was a board member, not only of Focus on the Family, but of Family Research Council. So she said, come to my house next week, do this again, we'll get it on film. And she handed it to Gary Bauer.
Who was this? Can you say?
This was Kim Bengard. Kim and Tom Bengard, yes.
So you're giving this testimony, but you're still attracted to women, I presume, during this period.
Yes.
So,
I mean, there's nothing that's changed in my sexuality in all these years.
So what's going through your head when you're saying this publicly, but yet you know you're still attracted? Did you have qualms about it? What was it like for you?
No, because it wouldn't matter if you still had same-sex attractions as long as you weren't acting on them. Then you're okay. Which actually doesn't really fit, because if you're going to talk biblically, the Bible says that even if you think a thought, you've committed that sin against someone. So it says even if you look upon a woman with lust, it's as if you've done the act. So we were told, though, no, just don't worry about it as long as you're not engaging.
And so they kind of swept that part of the Bible under the rug.
Right, exactly. It's like, but really, if you do have those thoughts.
So how long was it between your testimony and saying you should relocate to Washington, D.C.? Suddenly you're whisked to Washington, D.C. Talk about the whole getting there and what that was like, and your interview process.
And that was the spring. So this happened in April or May. I went to interview at Family Research Council in June. They flew me there. I was there for all of a Friday. And that's when I met Bob Knight. I met everyone anyone who worked there. They interviewed me each individually. And then I was offered the job the next day, and I moved the next month. So we're talking about 2 months.
And then suddenly there you are in the middle of this giant campaign. What was it like? Talk about your first day. What was it like? Suddenly you're at the Family Research Council as the spokesperson.
Well, I'll tell you, my real first day was, I got there, my apartment wasn't furnished, didn't have any furniture left, so I went and I stayed at a hotel in Alexandria, and I put the TV on the night before my first day, and there are Janet Folger and Michael Johnston against, I want to say, Elizabeth Birch, and I can't remember who the other one was. St. Pierre, Tracy St. Pierre.
St. Pierre of HRC, yes. Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what show it was, but it was the whole Talking Heads thing. And they were just pounding Janet Folger, and she did not have good answers, and she was not representing well at all. And I just almost, I could just feel the panic, like, oh my gosh, that could be me in a few days. Mm-hmm. That was my first day. That was the day before my first day. And on my first day, it was, here's all this literature, read up on it. And it was all, gay marriage, employment non-discrimination, hate crimes, get up to speed.
Mm-hmm. So you're here and you're a spokesperson. What was that experience like, being on all these shows and being quoted, and what was the experience like for you?
It was exciting. It was exciting to be in the limelight and getting a lot of attention. And I think that brought me to a point where I didn't do a whole lot of self-reflecting during that time, because there was always something new to go to. And it was a matter of, what are the talking points? What am I going to say here? If someone says this, how am I going to counter that? And that's all that I was thinking about all the time. Mm-hmm. But then there were these little cracks, and I would, look at these guys like the Michael Johnston and John Paulk, and I don't see them actually living the way that I think someone should live who is professed to be free of all of these attractions. And I remember going to speak on hate crimes legislation in Texas in front of a Senate committee there. And I was in the bathroom and I thought, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I remember that was the day that I really started having doubts. Like, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
What brought the doubts that day?
Seeing the Bird family, remember, he had been dragged behind that truck, and seeing them sitting there on the other side saying hate crimes legislation is necessary, and I'm on the other side up there in front of the Senate committee saying, no, we don't need these. These guys who dragged your father, your brother, your uncle, they're already in prison. What do we need those laws for? And as I'm sitting there thinking this, like, I just felt horrible. Like, no, I understand why we need those laws. I understand that people need to be, that examples need to be set. We as a country need to stand behind certain people and say, look, their lives matter. And that is not, that, you know, because my line there before the Senate was to say, look, why would my life be worth more before as a lesbian? And so you're going to punish someone more if they did raped or murdered me when I was a lesbian than now when I say that I'm ex-lesbian and just heterosexual. So my life would have been worth more then than it is now. At that moment when I'm saying that, I can see why those laws need to happen. And that's when I started thinking, this, I don't know how much longer I can do this, even though I did it for years and years and years after that.
How did you get to the point where you are today? When did you finally say, this is bullshit? And I can't believe, I just don't buy it anymore. Take us on that journey.
There was so much that led up to that because, okay, so I got married, I was pregnant, that's when I left FRC. And then I was working at a nonprofit that was part of my church called Living in Victory, which was an ex-gay ministry. And I also, through that, I was working for Athletes in Action, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. So I was working with lesbians. And I could just see their pain. Like these are women who are not going to change. They don't want to change, but they don't want to disappoint their coaches who are sort of encouraging them to go to these programs. And it was, you know, my daughter was diagnosed in 2009 with leukemia. And I had just done all this work on 2008, Prop 8 in California. And this was the first time that I didn't have anyone in my ear. I took a leave of absence from Exodus and I just concentrated on my daughter. I was having incredible anxiety because she was sick and then was diagnosed with PTSD. And I just thought, you know what, I can't listen anymore to what anyone else is telling me. I have to decide what I think and believe for myself, or I'm going to die. I'm going to be one of those people that is just riddled with so much angst from their post-traumatic stress disorder that I can't go on. You know, I just won't even be able to live my life, or I'm going to be so medicated that I can't function. And so I really have to straighten this out because my therapist told me, you have to be authentic, because sometimes anxiety and even trauma of any sort can come from not living authentically. So I said, well, I'm going to have to really come to terms with this and find out what authenticity is to me. And that's when I said, I just can't do this anymore.
What did it feel like? Was it the burden lifted right away? Talk about...
I was very afraid of what people were going to think of me. I was afraid of what's going to happen when I go public, and what are people going to say? And what are the people that I used to work with going to say? And that was my main concern. But there also, at the same time, was this huge burden lifted. Like, I didn't even realize how fake I was being until I wasn't fake anymore. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've been doing this. I can't believe I've been carrying this around.
What impact did that have on you when you had that realization?
I felt like, why did I believe this in the first place? I really had to go back and think, what really hooked me in? Why did I do this? I really need to understand that about myself, because I see that as a flaw that needs to be addressed. And, so there was this sense of, God, what? I thought I was better than that. I'm not as great as I thought I was, that I would be susceptible to this, and that I would be just so easily sucked in. And that was concerning. Like, I thought I was a discerning person, and I had to come to terms with the fact that I wasn't, that I could easily be sucked into something that, was as damaging as this was.
And what would you like to say to those who were LGBT, who saw you on TV or saw some of your work with FRC to them? What would you like to say to them now that may have been harmed by it?
There were people that I think of specifically that I have spoken to through Fellowship of Christian Athletes, Athletes in Action, Exodus, that I have talked to and said, I'm really sorry. I should have led you in a better way. And I wasn't the leader that I should have been. And I apologize for that. I really do. But there are other people who I didn't get a chance to do that with. And those are the ones when I spoke on college campuses and I spoke at conferences, and they would stand up and they would question me and they would plead with me to see their story, and I didn't at the time. And it sort of breaks my heart now that I didn't, because I know these are people who are living important lives who need to be heard, and I didn't hear them. And that's the number one criticism I have of the people on the side I was on. Like, you're not listening to people. Have you ever sat down with a trans person? I criticized trans people. I had never even met one or talked to any. And I have now many, and I hear their stories, and I get it, I understand now, and I'm so sorry that I didn't listen. I'm so sorry that I didn't listen and that I didn't understand. And I carried the full burden of that and full responsibility.
How did they react at FRC, your former colleagues?
People contacted me thinking that I was under the influence of a sorceress. This is after they read my book, Never Not Broken, where I talk about my journey out. And it's about my journey sort of into my internal journey. And I was in therapy with a psychologist who Harvard educated, who is using techniques that are as well respected and accepted in the mental health world as you can possibly be. And they were saying that I was under the influence, and Paul specifically said I was under the influence of a sorceress. But people at FRC, they were, we need to talk to you. We need to, you're not listening to the right people. Like, you know what? That's the thing. I am not listening to anyone. I'm listening to myself for the first time ever. I don't want to listen to anyone else. I don't need anyone else's input on my life. I know what I know and what I feel in my spirit, in my soul.
Do you think your story has any impact on them? Do you think they think twice about it? At your former colleagues on the right, about not promoting the ex-gay myth anymore, or they just have blinders on?
I think they have blinders on. I think they look at it as, Yvette went off the rails. And so another one bites the dust. I think that's how they look at it.
And that's why
which is sad, because I think, again, it's that not listening, not hearing.
And that's how they're able to promote this new crop with Change Movement and Restored Hope Network.
And I know my colleagues respected me. Absolutely. I have no question about that. And I think they look at it like, well, she just went down the wrong way because she was so severely impacted by her daughter's cancer. To my former colleagues from Family Research Council and the ex-gay movement and everyone else who I worked with, I just implore you to listen to the people who you're talking to and trying to legislate against and trying to convince to change. Just listen to their stories, listen to their heart, listen to what their lives are really like, instead of just looking at it through the lens of what you believe about the Bible, what you believe about how people should live. Just take those blinders off for a minute and listen to the heartfelt stories of people who deserve better. And these, trying to get rid of gay marriage again, trying to, tell people they can change, it doesn't do any good. All it does is crush souls. It crushes people's lives. And I've seen it, and I can't stand that I was a part of it. And I would hope that you would have the empathy and compassion to see that all it does is damage, and to really look and say, is this something that I can be proud of? Because the answer is no, it's not something to be proud of. It's actually something to be ashamed of. I'm ashamed of it. And I would hope that you who know me, you know me. You know who I've been. I've always been someone who's acted with integrity, and hopefully now as someone who just wants what's right and what's best for people. I hope you see that in me, and because of your respect for me in the past, that you would consider what I'm saying. I can't believe I'm sitting here talking to Wayne Besen. If you want to know the truth, like, what? Not in a million years I think that was going to happen. And yeah, thinking that we're talking about, we're opposite of how we were. John Paul, Alan Chambers, Randy Thomas. It's kind of fun, though.
What do you make of Ann Paulk and this Restored Hope Network and this whole sorcery? And it seems she's always been prone to spiritual warfare on this.
Yeah.
From her book, it really stood out. She knew she was pregnant when the cloud was in the shape of a baby, is one example.
Right.
Yeah.
And which is why Ann Paulk thinks I'm under the influence of a sorceress.
She actually believes all this stuff?
Who knows if she believes it or not. But I think that she's just very tied into that rigid thinking where you can't even begin to look outside of it. You can't begin to look at what someone else's viewpoint is. And you can't listen to it, because if you do, you might change yourself. I think she's just so committed and married to this. And think about it. There is money in this. There is money if you're the executive director of an ex-gay movement. You are going to be paid to do that job. If you look at Randy Thomas had to go out and get a regular job. So has Alan Chambers. So has John Paul. Like, people had to reinvent themselves and say, what am I going to do now? Why reinvent yourself when you can still get paid a decent living to just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again? And if you're talking about someone like Joe Dallas, it's even better than a decent living. Like, you're actually making big money to be telling people that they can change from gay to straight.
What's everyone's opinion of Narth, speaking of counselors, in this movement?
Narth was a little... I spoke at one of their conferences, a couple of their conferences, but there was always that sort of, well, you're so very secular and we're very Christian, so I don't know how the two are going to mix. But we would use their papers that they would put out to support our points. But they were sort of looked at a little skeptically.
Richard Cohen.
Richard Cohen, and it's okay if their penises touch. Remember that from the Exodus conference? So yeah, he was a piece of work with that. I don't even know if he still believes that, but if you're with a therapist and your penises are touching, there's probably a problem. I think a federal ban on conversion therapy needs to happen just so people know, and it's in the news, that this is something that is frowned upon. This is something that we're not going to tolerate, even though it won't touch the churches at all. But I think it will help with the public to know, look, this is something that they may not think about. They may not think about conversion therapy. They may not think about people trying to change from gay to straight. But if there's a federal ban, then it'll bring it to the forefront of the conversation. So I think it's important. I think religion is the bane of our existence. I don't think that it's done people many favors at all. I know people use it for comfort, and I can understand that when it comes to the end of life and wondering what comes after. But in terms of day-to-day living and the restrictions and constrictions that are put on people and how they're basically pushed into living lives that are inauthentic, I don't think it helps at all.